theory has to have a priority.
Capitalism and artificial intelligence are the same thing.
The dimension of the future has disappeared.
There is actually no representation anymore.
There is no final resolution to contradiction.
Militant proletarian snake handling over abysses never gets much wilder than this.
All right, everybody, welcome back to The Dangerous Maybe. And today we are once again joined by John Michael Greer. We are so glad to have him here. And, you know, this conversation you had with Nick Land a couple months ago, you know, it was fantastic. One of these kind of dream come true conversations. But we told you back then that we are both big fans of your book, The King in Orange. And we wanted to have a dedicated discussion to this important book, and here we are. So we're gonna be getting into this classic to me right here, The King in Orange, the magical and occult roots of political power. So hell yeah, thank you for being here, John.
Thank you very much for having me on. I figured
awesome.
I'm good.
We had a great
conversation last time. I look forward to having another great one this time.
Fantastic. Well, Nance, like you have thought, you read this book before I did. You've been sitting with it, dwelling with this, you know, thinking it through longer than I have. So I don't know. What do you think is the best place to start with this conversation?
I honestly think, maybe the most amusing for me, from my perspective, for my own purposes, would be to start with the beginning. And I was just telling Mikey earlier, rereading chapter 2 got me to go back to Capital, Volume 3. And maybe that may not make sense to a lot of people, but chapter 52 of Capital is where Marx tries to classify class and doesn't. He also in the 18th Brumaire, he talks about class a lot. In Volume 2, he talks about class and income. In the economic and philosophical manuscripts, he talks about class, but there's no hard definition of class. And Mikey and I, being in the spaces and circles we're in, we've had a lot of conversations and become exhausted with conversation about class, because many Marxists view it as this kind of triad, and it's like, well, yeah, but actually, but all that to say, the way you do like a structural analysis and the way you actually talk about class, I think is very, very interesting to me, someone coming from kind of a somewhat Marxist perspective. And I think that would benefit our dyed-in-the-wool Marxist friends to have you talk about class.
Benefit is kind of an interesting term here, but no, the thing is, it's important to understand, first of all, that Marx did not come up with the concept of class. Okay,
right?
He was largely riffing off of Giambattista Vico, who was hugely influential in a kind of hole and corner way. Everybody read Vico. Nobody liked to talk about him because he was the first major theorist of cyclical history in the modern Western tradition. He was active in the late 17th, early 18th century in Italy. And so he was really the last of the Renaissance thinkers. He was not a modern thinker in the usual sense, but he did try to come up with a way of talking about conflicts within societies, because he saw those as very important. He drew a lot of that from material from ancient Greek sources, which also dealt extensively with conflicts between aristocratic and popular factions, which were a major issue through the large sections of both Greek and Roman history. So I also was starting with Vico. I find Vico very useful, largely because Vico is in the business of manufacturing mythology and admits it and understands it. He's not trying to claim to be presenting a scientific theory, as Marx was. And Marx, of course, was not presenting a scientific theory. He was presenting a myth, a narrative, a framework that you can use for understanding. So the major challenge in taking any kind of myth and putting it to use is figure, okay, how do I ground this in actual lived reality? And that's a very challenging issue for a lot of people, because in many cases, people don't want their myths to be too grounded. One of the interesting things that I had when this book was actually, even before it came out, I was getting a lot of pressure from two different sides. On the one hand, the Marxists, who were insisting that my class analysis was all wrong because it didn't follow Das Kapital, okay? And on the other hand, you had the traditionalists who were insisting my class analysis was all wrong because it didn't use the Hindu caste system as its basis. And I was going, look, we don't live in ancient India. We don't have a Brahmin caste, a Kshatriya class, and so on and so forth. And they were just kind of looking past me. The point is, of course, that these myths, whether the Marxist or the traditionalist, are very convenient if you don't want to talk about the reality of class in your own life. And you, for example, if you happen to be a member of the salary class, but you still want to see yourself as being the heroic oppressed rebel alliance fighting against entrenched power, when you yourself actually have the entrenched power in society. Frank talk about the salaried class is not welcome. So, so what I did was start by saying, okay, how does class actually break out in American society? And that's when I settled on the framing narrative of looking at, okay, how do people get their money? Because it really does make a difference. If you look at, people who get a salary with benefits have a very different place in society than people who get a wage with no benefits. And we can distinguish those from those who make their money from investments, the capitalist class, if you will, and those who make their money from government welfare payments. Those are the four big classes in our society. There are other classlets. I mean, as I commented in the book, I belong to the royalty classlet. I get most of my money from, $1 or $2 from each book that's sold, each one of my books that's sold. That the royalty classlet is tiny enough, it has basically no power in society. And there are several other micro classes like that. Most people fall into one of the four that I've outlined, and you can tell a lot about their interests and about what they're going to support and what they're going to oppose if you realize who's making their money how.
Well, I think that isn't un-Marxist in a good way, like to say in a good way, because Marx does kind of talk a lot about the source of income, laborers, owners, rentiers. I think that the thing that I like so much about it is there is more freedom, and it is, I think, properly more in line with what Marx was getting at, because in chapter 52, Marx sets up the triad and then he immediately deconstructs it. And it like he never actually systematizes it to this hard thing. And I like what you're doing a lot. And the Hindu thing is interesting to me.
Oh, yeah. No, there's been this consistent tendency. You get a lot of traditionalists who are kind of, well, I don't know if there's a term for it. In pop culture, not too many years back, there was the term weeaboo, which is somebody who is all giddy about Japanese culture. Okay, now I speak here from personal knowledge. I was a weeaboo before there were weeaboos. I was crazy. I mean, the first anime I ever watched was Gigantor in black and white. Okay, I have weeaboo cred here, but there's something very like that, and has been for quite some time, in traditionalists and certain conservative circles in Europe and North America, the European diaspora, toward India. And not toward India as it actually exists, not toward India as this this extremely lively, complex, fractious democratic society that's rising right now toward world power, but toward the mythic India that a lot of people in Europe especially imagined in the 19th century, this sort of timeless land of mystics and warriors where the Mahabharata is still, practically front page news. And so I was not in the least surprised to get well, why aren't you analyzing it according to the caste system? Not least because intellectuals love it because they see themselves as Brahmins. And therefore, they should be the top caste and they should tell everyone else what to do, which, of course, is something a lot of intellectuals absolutely desperately wish they could. It's the driving power behind much of Marxism, the idea that if you happen to be a member of the Marxist intelligentsia, you can look forward to be the vanguard of the Great Revolution and eventually having a lucrative job in the nomenclatura once the Soviet Republic gets established. So Plato was not the first, but he was certainly a good example of the desperate craving of the intellectual for power.
Look, to me, I think your book, the dimension of it that's Marxist in the best sense to me is actually you attempt to think through the economic historical situation of Americans on its own terms. I think that's a true economic analysis that matters. And instead of trying to fit, transcendental use of universal categories on every economic situation and saying this is how it works. No, to me, that's completely anti-Marxist. So if there's an insight in Marx that I think is important, is if we're going to analyze an economic situation, we have to analyze it on its own terms, because if we take history seriously, what was going on 200 years ago is not going to be the dynamic that we're in today. And so the other thing is with this, this notion of the salary class, I can't help but connect it to the work of Barbara Ehrenreich on the professional managerial class. And
Ehrenreich's work is good. Ehrenreich's work is solid and informed some of what I did.
Okay. That's what I was going to ask you.
Exactly. Because, there are some limits to her analyses, but, she is a member of the class she critiques. But both her work on the managerial class and her work on the effects on the working class, and also interestingly her study of new thought, Bright-Sided, is very, very important as I see it, in talking about the to jump ahead a little ways, the hypostitions that help to disguise power in our current society.
Okay. We'll get into hyperstition, we'll get into meme magic, we'll get into hypostition.
Hypostition. Nance, I'm going to be really interested to hear. I know you have also the concept retrostition. I'm intrigued to learn what that's about, but we'll get to it.
Awesome. Look, this work, I think it would be helpful to kind of give some context here. So kind of what inspired you originally to write it? Why did you feel called, like, this book needs to exist? And now that, some years have gone by, how do you view it, in a kind of retrospective way?
Okay. The major thing that led me to write the book was simply the experience of going through the 2016 presidential election and its aftermath. Okay. I lived at that time in a little red brick mill town in the north central Appalachians, an old, the kind of place that was full of industry 100 years ago and was mostly full of desperate poverty when I lived there. And it was a town that voted 70% for Donald Trump. And it was very clear to me well before it happened that this town was going to vote that way. But nobody wanted to hear why. Now, mind you, this is not a right-wing town. It's the town in question has a drag queen pageant every year. It has gay bars. When the Klan showed up, and the Klan did show up once while I was there, they had a recruiting drive in a little park up on one of the hills. Every church in town turned out on the other side of the street, sang hymns. Black churches, white churches, everybody sang hymns at the top of their lungs to drown the Klan out. And once the Klan was chased out, and they finally gave up because they literally couldn't hear themselves speak, you have like 1,000 people on the other side of there belting out, white hymns, black hymns. It's hard to think. So they did that, and then after that, they went down to the river nearby and did this kind of picnic and prayer service of Thanksgiving. The black churches, the white churches, everybody got along. This is the kind of place where if you walked in the poor neighborhoods, if you walk down a street on a summer afternoon or evening, when there's people on the porches tipping back beers, not on one porch will everybody have the same skin color. Interracial marriage is common among the poor. You see kids playing in playgrounds. It's a mixed bag. You see plenty of multiracial kids. It doesn't correspond. This is well into flyover country. It is very poor. It is very rural. It does not correspond to the stereotypes that people in the coastal bubbles have of poor flyover America. And yet, these were the people who voted overwhelmingly for Trump. And meanwhile, everybody I knew on the salary class left was yelling at the top of their lungs, insisting that nobody could possibly vote for Donald Trump unless they were an evil, jackbooted racist who was motivated solely by racial hatred. And when I tried to point out to them, do you realize you're shoveling smoke? Oh, did they get angry at me? That's when it became very clear to me that they knew perfectly well that they were lying. They knew perfectly, but they weren't willing to confront the reality of the situation. That led me into a study of salary class privilege. We can say it right out, middle class privilege, and the overwhelming role of class conflict on the part of the middle class against the working class in America over the last 50 years. And the extent to which that, not, jackbooted racism or any of the other things that Trump's opponents like to push, is the reason why people voted for Trump. And it's the reason they're still voting for Trump. The problem with the existing order of society I saw was that it basically funneled all of the benefits to the salary class and piled all the costs onto the wage class. And the wage class was desperate. I knew people who committed suicide because they couldn't get jobs. As in, stick a shotgun muzzle against the roof of your mouth and pull the trigger. It was a mess. That kind of thing happens all the time because policies that until Trump were supported by both parties, policies enthusiastically backed by good, compassionate liberal people, were driving wages down to starvation levels, where they didn't make jobs unavailable completely to vast swaths of the population, and driving up real estate prices, which again helps the middle class. The value of their property goes up, but crushes the working class. And I could go on for a long time, but nobody was willing to talk about these things. So, but credit my autism, credit the simple fact that I tend to make, my reputation is one of talking about things nobody wants to talk about. So I wrote a book on that. Originally, I wrote a whole series of blog posts, and they got enormous readership. I have never had, I was at one point getting 250,000 unique page views a month, which for a little blog out on the fringes is pretty good. Yeah. And I was getting denounced in incandescent tones by a lot of people, which is fine. That's good advertising for me. But that's what led me to write the book. In retrospect, I think I called it, and the thing that I did not expect was precisely that what would happen once Trump broke through the sort of rigid barrier to participation outside from outside the bubble, is that so many people would follow him, and so many of them would have different agendas. At this point, things are really up in the air. There are a lot of extremely interesting, both positive and negative senses, people who are pouring into politics right now. We saw in the primaries recently that establishment candidates are getting slaughtered. Establishment candidates among the Republicans and far left candidates on the Democrats are being they're being hauled out of the trash. I mean, John Cornyn was one of the most powerful people in Washington, D.C., and he got a third of the vote in his own primary. That's almost unheard of. So we have, in effect, a revolution underway. And I was not expecting that. I was not expecting things to take off as quickly as they did to set as many things in motion. Where it's going to end, I don't know yet, but it is wild to watch. I expected this to work more or less as a mid-course correction. Instead, everything's up in the air.
Okay, so here's the thing. A lot of the audience is not going to get the reference in the title, the King in Orange. Now, they can probably imagine King in Orange, Donald Trump, right?
Everywhere.
But they might not get the reference to the King in Yellow. So could you maybe explain this reference, and then you also talk about the orange sign? Could you break that down?
I'm gonna pop back a little bit here.
Okay.
Because at the time all this was happening, I had been plunged into the biggest fiction project I've ever written. Okay. For years I had thought of writing a story about the H.P. Lovecraft Cthulhu mythos from the other point of view. You know, taking not these horrible elder gods, they're going to eat us all or what have you. But what if they're the good guys? What if these sinister multiracial cultists that Lovecraft was so terrified of are just a persecuted religious minority? Okay. What happens if we stand it? And I had this idea, and it kind of drifted in and out for a while.
It's a great plot twist.
It's the kind of thing I like to do. One of these days, I'm going to do a standard Tolkien-esque Dark Lord story from the Dark Lord's point of view. That's going to be fun.
Awesome.
But I had this idea, and then what happened was in the fall of 2015, I literally had a novel download itself into my head. I've never had anything quite that dramatic happen, and literally it took me 8 weeks to write a 70,000 word novel. I had never done anything like that, but that turned out to be the first of a series of 7. And to make it work, because my idea is, okay, I'm not just going to borrow a few things from the Cthulhu mythos here. I'm going to marinate myself in the old Weird Tales stories by Lovecraft, by Robert E. Howard of Conan fame, also wrote some really good stories in that sort of course, Clark Ashton Smith, and a range of others, Henry Kuttner. There's a lot of them. There's a whole stable of them who were feeding into this mythos. And so I spent quite some time, that was all I read. And of course, there was, Robert W. Chambers, The King in Yellow. Chambers is a weird cat because he wrote one piece of fiction that's worth remembering. All of his later stuff are romantic potboilers, even when they sort of stray into tentacle territory, which they don't often. But some of the stories that make up The King in Yellow are brilliant. And what pervades them is this sense of the familial world cracking subtly and something else coming in, something from Carcosa, the land, the realm of the King in Yellow, of Hastur. And that, this, and gradually the world goes mad for his characters as this influence from the totally unimaginable, totally outside our frame of reference seeps into the world. It's great stuff. And so what really struck me as I watched people go stark staring nuts over Trump's candidacy and then his presidency, as I watched people lose it completely, it felt the same way. It felt as though, there I was in 1920 1900s Paris, and the sky was gradually turning white with the black stars of Carcosa. It was eerie. I actually consider writing a story called The King in Orange, in which people were like pounding their heads against brick walls, shrieking Trump, Trump, Trump till they died. And eventually the main character stumbles down to the Potomac, and the skies of Carcosa are opening and black pyramids are rising as Carcosa comes into manifestation. Instead, I wrote a nonfiction.
Sounds like a great time. It's going to be the best.
More or less the same theme. But that sense of the unearthly, of the incomprehensible breaking through was very much on my mind as I watched people wig out completely over what is, after all, a perfectly ordinary event in the history of any democracy, the election of a populist leader who rises to power because he figures out how to harness the demands of the masses, which have been ignored too long. That's what's going on here.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not how most people wanted to hear it. That's not how they take it. So what are you going to do?
Yeah. Okay. So I guess the thing I would say, I mean, I think it would be good to start because I think you provide a lot of the context that you get at in the first chapter so far. I mean, obviously there's the dimension of how bad the Democrats had messed up.
Well, there's that.
There's that. But I think maybe it's best to discuss magic and the American class system. And kind of, I think it would help because a lot of our viewers, they're not familiar with the occult. They're not familiar with magic. And upon hearing it, they're like, wait, magic factors into politics? They're like, what do you mean?
Yeah.
And they're not going to understand the subtlety of what's actually going on here. So I think it would be helpful what is magic, John, for you? And how do magic and politics relate?
Okay, first of all, I want all of our audience to take everything they ever saw from those wretched Harry Potter novels and films, pile it in a heap, douse it in kerosene, and set it on fire. Okay? That's not what we're talking about. Okay, magic is not about getting a wand containing pieces of some non-existent animal, wave it in the air, shouting "Ungrammaticus Latinus" or something like that, and having the laws of nature violated. There's a reason why that kind of thing is so popular in pop fiction, that's because it makes it easier for people not to notice the reality of magic as a constant factor in everyday life. The figure that I tend to turn to here for a useful explanation is Ioan Coleanu, who was a Romanian-American historian of religions, and one of whose major foci was Renaissance magic. He pointed out that magic is a constant feature of modern societies to the extent that we don't need jackboots and armbands anymore. We have public relations. Dion Fortune, who was one of the major practitioners of magic, one of the best teachers of magic, and also a major theoretician in the mid-20th century in England, said you define magic as the art and science of causing changes in consciousness in accordance with will. It's a trickier definition than it sounds like because it doesn't specify whose consciousness, it doesn't specify whose will. Okay, when a public relations type, goes to work trying to make Joe Biden, let's say, look like a dynamic, active, intelligent human being and not, say, a cauliflower, they're engaging in magic. They're trying to cause changes in the consciousness of their audience in accordance with the will of whoever's paying their salary. Okay. A lot of people will go, oh, you're just talking about psychology. And that's true in a certain sense. It's just that psychology has been working on this for about 150 years. Magic, as a continuous tradition in the Western world, has about a 5,000-year history so far. We've learned a few things. We've learned rather a few things, and we're better at them than most psychologists are. But there is a difference because a lot of the psychology, especially when it comes to marketing and things like that, most of that is aimed at masses. It's not personally specific. It can't be. You're trying to, say, sell Joe Biden to an audience, or sell fizzy brown sugar water to an audience, or sell some other product, and the audience is a mass. So you're aiming very broad spectrum, very lowest common denominator appeals toward everybody that you can reach. Whereas most magic, as it's practiced, is actually, when it's done properly, it's aimed by the magician at himself or herself. Okay. So much of what we experience in life is a function of our own understandings of the world, of our own understandings of ourselves, of our own understanding of situations. Change those, we change our possibilities. It's not that hard. If I may bring in myself an example, when I was in my 20s, I was working minimum wage jobs, trying to scrape by. I had very few prospects. I grew up at the bottom end of the middle class, but I was an early participant in the downward mobility that so many people are now beginning to experience. I pulled myself out of that very efficiently. And I did it not by casting spells, but by learning the techniques of magic that taught me to use will and imagination to revise my understandings of myself, my situation, of the world, and to take advantage of the many opportunities that are available to us all. That's magic. That's, to use Eliphas Levi's term, that's high magic. There are always, as far as magic and politics, magic and politics. Obviously, I think most of our audience will realize by now, magic and politics are inseparable. You're always trying to change people's consciousness into thinking that, your party, your candidate is going to do something for them or to them that they think they want, and that the candidate probably can't do and almost certainly wouldn't want to. And the other side's doing exactly the same thing. Okay, everybody's trying to play these magical games. And now, in point of fact, magic has always been inseparable from, I'm going to use the term, political economy. Okay, and I want to stress that term, by the way, because one of the reasons that political science and economics both in our modern world suck is that they try to deal with those two things in isolation from each other. You cannot understand politics unless you understand the economic dimension. You cannot understand economics unless you understand the political dimension. The reason that Marxist regimes don't work is that they neglect the political dimension of, what happens. The supposed dictatorship of the proletariat is never a dictatorship of the proletariat. It's a dictatorship of the nomenclatura, inevitably, because that's how politics works. So, if you want to do something else, you need to do something else. But so you always have two things going on in any society. You have the magic of the overprivileged, and you have the magic of the underprivileged. Okay, because you always have people, who are low down on the pyramid, who are trying to use magical means to achieve things that they want out of their lives, and they'll turn more and more to magic as other ways of getting access to these things become harder and harder to get to. The fact that magic has been so insanely popular over the last half century will show you something of what's been going on in the United States, for example. You also have the magic of the overprivileged classes who are trying to maintain themselves in their position by convincing everyone else. Well, first of all, by convincing everyone else that, no, this is what you have is what you should have. And it's the best you can hope for. And on the other hand, trying to convince themselves that everything is for the best in this best of all possible worlds. And so between these two bands of quarreling sorcerers, modern history is woven.
Okay, let me ask you this, just because you kind of mentioned. So take an ad man. I think of the show Mad Men, right? You take a guy like Don Draper. He has some kind of intuitive sense on how to sell people a fantasy, a dream that can make them do things in accordance with, if not his will, at least with the
will of his employers. Yes,
exactly, right. So is this an example? Obviously, he's not rooted in the occult. He doesn't know magic in the traditional sense. But would you say this is an instance of somebody having a kind of intuitive, magical power?
Well, keep in mind that people have been doing this for quite a few years now, many decades. The profession of advertiser, of ad man, and so on, of marketer, that's been going for a while, and it's picked up a certain amount of knowledge. If you compare the ads that were being used in, say, 1820 to the or 1826, let's say, to the ads being used in 2026, there's a great deal of increasing sophistication over time, and that's simply, a sort of Darwinian process where people figure out what works and ditch the things that don't and experiment with new things and so on. So there is a certain amount of actual knowledge that these people have picked up, that they learn either in getting a degree in marketing, or more likely in, once they go to work for a marketing firm, somebody takes them aside and said, forget everything you learned at the university. It doesn't actually matter. Here's how we do things. And then, they in effect apprentice to senior admin, and they end up knowing a fair amount about how to manipulate the clueless into doing things that are counter to their own interests, but benefit the employers of the admin.
So, you mentioned in the classic definition, in accordance with the will, but obviously a lot of what is going on here, I mean, and because maybe the word will doesn't bring this out, so I think it helps, is desire, right? It's an ability to affect, understand, change, desire, right? Is that fair?
Well, desire and aversion. The Buddha was right that those are the two hounds that chase us back and forth like a rabbit. But those are tools. Those are not the driving force of the whole process. One of the reasons, in fact, that the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016 crashed and burned so catastrophically is that they could not set aside their own desire in order to use will. You have to be able to step back from your own desires, to look at your desires as though they are someone else's, and instead, what do you will to accomplish? This is a basic rule of magic. This is why, and divination is the same way. Many people who will do tarot readings or what have you for other people will go to someone else when they have a question because they can't set their own desires aside. It takes a lot of practice and discipline to learn how to do that, to look at your own wants and needs as though they were someone else's, as though they don't matter to you. You have to do that to be successful in magic, because otherwise you end up doing what Hillary Clinton did. And, coming up with all these wonderful things that will convince people to already agree with her, and that did absolutely nothing for the people who didn't. So desire is a tool. The desires of others, okay, are primarily the tools of evil magic, okay? Because evil magic, we can define evil magic operationally here. Evil magic works by making people stupid, okay? Imagine a billboard, okay? Here is a billboard that is advertising fizzy brown sugar water, okay? Now it's not doing this by, somehow communicating the wonderful virtues of fizzy brown sugar water, which don't have, fizzy brown sugar water has no virtues. It tastes a little like carbonated prune juice. It rots your teeth. It doesn't benefit you in any way. And yet, so what do you have? You have this group of young, handsome, well-dressed, obviously have plenty of money people. They're laughing. They're having a great time against a background that makes it clear there's someplace fun. And they're tipping back cans of fizzy brown sugar water. Okay. You're trying to make people stupid by convincing them at a nonverbal, non-rational level that if they drink fizzy brown sugar water, they're going to be like those people. And because we're all social primates, what primate see, primate do, there's that tendency to be sucked into the image. But that's stupid. We all know that won't work. All you'll get from drinking fizzy brown sugar water is larger dentist's bills. Okay? And yet, so evil magic works by making you more stupid. Positive magic works by making you smarter. It allows you to put your desires in context. It allows you to replace desire with will, to replace rigid notions of what the world actually is with imagination. It allows you to open things up and find spaces of possibility where you can do things. And that literally makes you smarter. So if you're doing it the right way, and that almost always has to be done on a one-on-one basis, if you're doing it the right way, the people if you're working on yourself, if you're working for someone else, it's going to make you smarter. It's going to give you more possibilities, more freedom, more options. That's what any system, especially in its decadence, cannot abide. We can't have people having options. They have to do what we want them to do, or the whole system comes crashing down. Okay, so desire is important, but you have to watch it, because desire is the handle by which you are, one of the two handles by which you're manipulated. The other one is aversion, hatred, loathing. Use whatever term. Aversion is the usual translation of the Sanskrit term the Buddha used. We'll use that. You show people something that makes them go, ugh, or you whip people into a frenzy and use the symbols of the other side to make them go into a complete meltdown. Again, now all sides use this. I knew people who could, during Obama's presidency, who could not see a picture of Barack Obama without shouting insults at it. Of course, we all know there are plenty of people now who cannot see a picture of Trump without going into a foam-flecked frenzy. Both sides have become stupid. They become more reactive, less capable of thinking, because all they do is emotionally react. That's aversion.
Yeah.
Okay.
So here's the thing. When I was reading chapter 3, and I think we should touch on this, and then we'll get into to me, one of my favorite chapters, chapter 4. Then we'll get into it. But chapter 3 is the pallid mask, spells of privilege, prejudice, and injustice. And I think, when I was reading this word spells, again, it's just like the word magic. People are going to have misconceptions and presuppositions that distort what's going on here. But it's funny, John, when I was reading that, I just so happened to rewatch John Carpenter's They Live. And it's funny, once he puts the glasses on, he can see like the hidden messages that are influencing everyone's behavior, getting them to act in accordance with the will of the power elite, right? And it's like these hidden words, signifiers, commands are kind of spell. And I think it's one of these things that's helpful for somebody who's not familiar with magic to go, oh, well, that's very relatable. I understand, like, there's a power, there's an influence in these words, these injunctions, these commands, and they do shape our lives. And then once you're able to see them for what they are and actually have some critical distance, you can start to realign your will, right? There's something there. So I just thought this is an example that can kind of help, concretize, what we mean by spell. Like you said, it's not some, I do a ritual or I make a spell and I'm trying to, I want to affect the balls so I win the lottery. So I get all the balls and I'm supernaturally, it's like, this is not what is going on. So,
and again, people have been taught that to keep them from recognizing their own power. As long as they can be tricked into wasting their time trying to do something that they can't do, they won't realize what they can do, which is step back from all the yelling, turn off the TV, please. Or if better still, take it out of the fire escape, as I did with the last television my late wife and I owned. We've only been married for a few months. Her brother gave us a television because he couldn't stand the thought that we were living without one. We stuck it under the vacuum cleaner. After a while, I forget what happened. Something happened, and we wanted to check the news, so we got it out, and it wouldn't work. So with my late wife's permission, with Sarah's permission, I walked the thing out onto the fire escape and dropped it 2 stories straight down into the open dumpster. The flash as the picture tube imploded was frankly more entertaining than anything that had ever appeared on that screen. Okay. Television is a drug. It's an electronic drug. It's, I think, the first widely used electronic drug. But I'm sure you have, everybody who's sat there watching something that they didn't really want to watch, but somehow never got around to turning off. There you sit with drool puddling in your lap. It puts you into an alpha state and not a healthy alpha state. It's an electronic drug. It's kind of a mild narcotic, and it's not good for you. I mean, partly because of the effect of any drug on you, but partly and crucially because it's a way to fill your mind with commercial crap so you don't have time and space to think your own thoughts. Okay. So you step back from things like that. You step back from the constant 24/7 immersion in corporate manufactured pseudoculture. And then maybe, just maybe, you start to realize that there are things you want that you want. It's not just that the corporations want you to want them. Okay. It's not just that some ad man is trying to convince you that you ought to want this. There are things you want and things that you don't want. That's a magical act. And then now, in terms of spells, I mean, do occultists use rituals? Of course they do. Do they use verbal spells? Yes, that too. Do they use strange symbols? Yeah, quite a few of them. Let's look at those in terms of their mental effect. What is a ritual? It's a little symbolic drama that acts out something. Okay, Symbolic psychodrama is powerful stuff as a way to awaken and direct and channel an intention. It's very potent. Symbols, again, well, there was a guy named Carl Jung once who wrote a little bit about that. Those things have power. They have a great deal of emotional and psychological power. They can really catalyze changes. Verbal comments. I mean, you know, a verbal statement of intention is very powerful. We've all encountered situations where a few words at the right place or the wrong place cause dramatic changes in consciousness. These are the tools that occultists work with. We're fairly good at it. Well, some of us are fairly good at it, as we'll be discussing down the road. Some of us are really lousy at it. But yeah, think of the word spell. We talk about spelling a word. Some old-fashioned school districts may still have spelling bees, and they're not, picking up wands and putting on pointed hats and things. Well, I don't know, maybe they are these days, but one can dream. But yeah,
they're having a Harry Potter themed spelling bee.
There we go. But the point is that that's the term to spell, or sit for a spell. You'll hear that in rural America sometimes. It's not this exotic word. It simply means putting something together with an intention. Okay, real simple.
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? Like in politics, obviously, that's operative all over the place.
Oh my God, yes, yeah. And there again, you have effective spells. MAGA, Make America Great Again. That was a very potent spell among people for whom life in America had become far from great. People who were in poverty and misery and saw nothing ahead under current management but more of the same. MAGA was potent sorcery. Then you have the Clinton campaign. I'm with her. Notice what's implied here. Not she's with me. It's all about Hillary Clinton's ego. Do you recall when I think this may have been the time when she ran and was beaten by Obama back in 2008. And she started out her speech announcing her candidacy with, "I am so ready to lead." Okay, now give us some reason why we should want you. She never did. It seems never to have occurred to her or to her handlers that maybe it wasn't all about her, that maybe the fact that she wanted something did not give people reason to give it to her. There was an overwhelming sense of entitlement, which did not go over well and which doomed her ambitions, to be quite frank. But because she could never see that she actually had to treat the voters as, people who had needs, who had wants, who had to be convinced that voting for her really was in their best interest, not just in her best interest. That is bad magic. That is a good example, in fact, of hypostition, which we'll get to. So,
but John, she really, really, really wanted it.
I know, and plenty of 3-year-olds really, really, really want things that they probably shouldn't have. Unfortunately, we have an enormous number of overgrown 3-year-olds in this country.
But she wanted it.
Yeah, I know. Did she? Yes. The thing is, normally, most people respond to that kind of 3-year-old behavior by wanting to bend the 3-year-old over their knee and paddle them. And I think that's basically what happened to Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, more or less.
He got spanked by the American people.
So, okay. So, John, I was telling you, this chapter 4, the orange sign, the coming of the Keck Wars. This is the one that I've spent the most time on, and in the new edition of my book, I've put in a long discussion of this in the chapter on hyperstition, because I was like, I think this is the best like nuanced analysis of how hyperstition actually works in a political context. And so, but Nance, like you've thought so much about this, you're working on hypostition. John's thinking about it. What's going on with hyperstition, Nance?
So hyperstition. I think when I talk to people about the King in Orange, which I have done several times in the past several years, I think it's an excellent book, and a lot of the time, maybe even most of the time, I explain it by saying it's a book about hyperstition, even though the term is not in the book. But it is this section, the meme war, and the kind of the activity that these people got up to on the internet, and they were doing these things to achieve a goal that actually seemed that they did achieve it in this weird way. And there was even an instance of Hillary, they memed so hard and they were like, Hillary's going to be sick. And then she fell down in public, and that was a victory for these people.
That was amazing to watch at the time.
Yeah. I think that's a good explanation of hyperstition. And then hypostition is, I think, just the opposite. I think, Mikey, the shorthand that I like to use, and I think you have a better explanation of it, even though it's the word I used. Hyperstition is a type of self-fulfilling prophecy. Hypostition is a self-undermining prophecy. And I connect it to perversion. I connect it to fetishistic disavowal, which is kind of getting afield from the conversation we're currently having. But if effective magic is hyperstitional, then this type of bad magic would be hypostitional. The fact that Hillary wants to lead,
and behaves in a way that prevents her from leading. In fact, we've come to essentially the same definition. That's fascinating.
Cool.
Yeah.
I do think it's because I come at it from I'm drawing on Heidegger and I'm drawing on Lacan, and I just use the word because, again, I like to smell my own farts and be fancy and use words, but it does sound like the way you use it, you use it in the same way.
It makes perfect sense. There are magical practices that tend to be effective, and that are meant to be effective, that are meant to bring things about. There are also magical practices that effectively are meant to be self-canceling. One of the things, we've watched the so-called magic resistance. Okay, the people who, as soon as Trump was elected, set out to destroy him through magic. I use them as the best available examples of how not to do magic. And it's been extremely useful to me, because everything they've done has been so obviously a violation of the basic principles of magic that it's not surprising that they've failed as abjectly as they have. Magic, to be successful, magic needs absolute unity of purpose. Everything you're doing has to focus on a single goal. And then you have these situations where people are invited to bring every imaginable dissatisfaction they have so they can scream them out and on the assault. For what? So that they can scream? Mostly, yes. And there are some weird aspects to it. This has become especially clear recently. Have you noticed how much of the talk about the Trump administration, ICE, everything like that, focuses on sexual metaphors and sexual terms? It's always fuck Trump, fuck ICE. Recently, there was this situation where women were gathering to fling dildos at various aspects. You do not have to be Sigmund Freud to realize what's going on here. Okay, let's be blunt. Okay, clearly, an enormous number of these women desperately want to be bent over Donald Trump's knee and spanked until they reach orgasm. It's really pretty obvious. And these are the same women who made 50 Shades of Grey a bestseller. And I think what we have here is the downside of a culture of permissiveness that has turned out to be very dissatisfactory to many, many people, very dissatisfying. And yet people's identities, their egos are all caught up in being free and independent and irresponsible, but they don't actually want that. They're not happy with that. So they read novels about women being dominated by bad boys, and they, fling heaps of dildos at the feet of Donald Trump or what have you. And they obsess with sexual metaphors. Again, you don't have to be Sigmund Freud to figure out what's going on here. And that's also very much hypostitional, because what they think they're doing is not what they're doing. They think they're, being strong and independent and acting out their rage against the evil Donald Trump, and they're actually saying, "Daddy, spank me. Give me show me some limits. Place, show me that you care by putting some limits on me," as again 3-year-olds do fairly often.
Yeah.
And that's exactly the sort of thing you always have this in a hypostitional situation. One example that I use in my book is the way that New Thought has turned into a drug for the privileged classes, for the overprivileged. New Thought being the American spiritual movement we think of when we think of affirmations, when we think of the law of attraction, which is not a law, by the way. The notion that if you simply inflate your sense of entitlement to the bursting point, the universe must cater to you. That's actually really powerful magic and really useful magic when it is applied, when it is used by the underprivileged. Because you see this with in the original market for New Thought was middle-class women in New England in the 1850s and 60s, who were expected to lead lives of total uselessness. Because, to be a respectable person meant you had servants to do all the work. But they weren't allowed to participate in politics or any of this stuff. And so they were expected to just sit there as being decorative. Of course, many of them ended up, because they had nothing else to do with their time, getting sick from psychosomatic diseases, because at least it gave them some break in the monotony and some power over their husbands. The use of sickness as passive-aggressive manipulation goes way back. And so the guy who invented New Thought and the early practitioners in New Thought, they came to these women and said, no, you can actually do anything you want to. You have power. And that was revolutionary for them. And they got out there and organized things like anti-slavery groups and so on. And it became just a revolutionary situation. In the same way, New Thought got going in the African-American community, not too many decades after that. And it was hugely successful because, again, African-American people have been told over and over again, you're worthless, you can't do anything, blah, blah, blah. And all of a sudden, they had these ways of making them feel that they could do something. So it's great in that situation. It builds confidence. It makes it possible to achieve amazing things. But when people who already have an overinflated sense of entitlement start using these techniques, they get their copy of Rhonda Byrne's book, The Secret, or what have you, and they become convinced that if only they whine loudly enough to the universe, that, the great Sky Daddy will give them everything they want, it leads them into psychosis. I've seen people crash and burn repeatedly. When The Secret was all the rage, I was living in Southern Oregon at the time. And I knew like a dozen people who all had The Secret and were all out there. They were convinced they were going to make big bucks flipping houses in the real estate boom. You remember how that ended? Every single one of them had to declare bankruptcy. They lost everything. Okay.
Yikes.
And they never understood. It never sunk in that, in fact, they'd done it to themselves. So, that's another example of hypostition. And that's a kind of situational hypostition. Attitudes that are very powerful if you have one set of experiences can be very destructive if you have another set of experiences.
Well, right. So, CCRU, if we go back to the classic definition, a hyperstition is a fiction that makes itself real. So a hypostition would be a fiction that thinks it's making itself real while acting to ensure it does not become real.
Yeah. As a fiction is a self-canceling intention.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Where a hypostition is a magical intention that seeks to realize itself. A hypostition is a magical intention that seeks to deny itself.
And see, one of the things CCRU emphasized, and I like this, I think this is important, is for them, yes, hyperstitions are fictions that make themselves real, but they were always quick to emphasize, but there has to be a material traction. It's not going to make itself real just poof out of nowhere.
Bingo.
It's going to take a certain circuitry, to kind of put it in cybernetic terms, but it's going to take a certain effectivity in the world for this to build into a reality. And for them, that's why they emphasize cybernetics, is that cybernetics is caught up in this where there has to be positive feedback loops for these kinds of thresholds to be crossed that make fictions into realities.
In magical philosophy, the idea is you have to bring things down to the material plane. In traditional magical philosophy, imagine several different planes of being, each of which are modes of human experience. Okay, there's a lot of complicated theory that we don't have to get into. But the world of sensory experience, the world we experience with our 5 ordinary senses, that's what occultists, old-fashioned occultists like me, call the material plane. Your magic must ground out here in the material plane if it's going to have an effect, not merely on the material plane, but anywhere. It has to, because the idea is that the symbolic idea is that everything begins at the level of spirit, cycles down to the realm of matter, and then cycles back up. And so you have to bring it all the way down for it to affect any plane. So that there has to be some action in matter. So, for example, if you do a working, you need a job, okay? You do a working to get a job. You then need to get your butt out there and start applying for jobs.
But what if you just sit in your room and wish real hard?
You're practicing hypostition.
Okay.
Yeah. So you have to carry it through to the material action. Thus, magic is not a substitute for material action. It is a supplement for material action. It works best combined with practical action.
Okay, so chapter 4, we're talking about hyperstition, we're talking about hypostition, but this thing that happened with the Keck Wars, with Pepe the meme of Pepe the Frog, John, can you kind of tell us about what you see as the magic that basically intervened in 2016 that got Trump elected?
That was the weirdest experience, because as soon as I started talking in January of 2016, I published a blog post saying that I think Trump's going to win the election, and most people were still treating Trump as a joke at that point. But I posted this, and so I started having people from 4chan and the chans generally. I started having them show up. Partly they were interested in magic and they wanted to toss questions my way. Partly they were simply they were intrigued that somebody else thought it was a possibility. And so I actually got to watch a fair amount of this stuff as it unfolded. I lurk in various places, and yes, I've lurked on the chans. And so it was a bizarre experience watching all of these young guys, mostly young men, not entirely, not all. Many of them unemployed, basement dwelling, you know the type. Yep. That's the world that's what society offered them, and that's what they did. And so they had lots of time on the internet, and they had lots of spare time to practice chaos magic. And once a few people started to say, "Hey guys, here's this thing called chaos magic. Let's see what it'll do. Let's see if," and yeah, their big project was to let's get Trump elected. They realized that we haven't talked about sigils and hypersigils yet. That's specific to chaos magic. In chaos magic, unlike many other forms, uses what's called a sigil, which is a visual symbol that's used as a focus of concentration for intention for magical workings. They use sigils the way the rest of us use, for example, verbal spells. A hypersigil is a sigil that's designed to be used by many people. And it turns out that internet memes make absolutely first-rate hypersigils. And of course, the chans were all over internet memes. They played a very large role in inventing. In fact, ICANN has cheeseburger. I think that was a 4chan creation. And so, yeah, so they were on top of that technology way ahead of everyone else. And so they started turning out these Trump will win sigils of various kinds and pumping energy into them, doing the various chaos magic practices, and synchronicities started happening. Now, this is, of course, Carl Jung talks about synchronicities, but you'll find the term is omen in older traditions. When you start getting meaningful coincidences that seem to be going the way you want, that's everyone in the occult scene knows. Okay, something's moving. And it just built. And then came the day that you talked about when Hillary Clinton went. It was September 11th, as I recall, and she went to give a speech, and she denounced Pepe the Frog right there on network television. And of course, all the chancellors were going, "Whoa, we've hit the big time." And so, but that happened, and then she went off, and just before she got into her SUV, she collapsed. Everyone likes saying like a side of beef. I think it looked more like a sack of potatoes myself, but I'm not going to argue with the mythology. Down she went, and had to be hauled into the SUV. And that same day, some unknown person on 4chan, on Poll, the politically incorrect message board there, found an old Europop song titled Chatelet. It's in Italian. It makes no sense at all. Chatelet is just one of those words. But it was done by a band named PEPE, Pepe the Frog and so on. And the record label had a magic frog on it, a frog with a wizard's hat. And they say, okay, we have received a vote of confidence here from the powers that are flowing through us. And they flung themselves into the election, into doing their chaos magic, and Trump won those handful of critical counties in the northern Midwest and became president. Okay. When up until the last moment, of course, Clinton was convinced that she was going to win because she wanted it so badly. And all of her people were convinced that she was going to win because they all won. I mean, she spent a lot of money getting everything in place for her victory celebration, and then all that, none of that ended up being used. It really does look as I'm not going to argue the point with a rationalist, but it really does look as though maybe some magic got used here. Maybe just and you see this in a purely psychological sense. Maybe it was just enough people got the memes, got the message, got the energy, and felt, yeah, Trump is a creep, but it's not going to be 4 more years of business as usual, and I can't stand business as usual any longer. So there we go.
I will say this. Here's the thing, and I think this needs to be stressed, especially, younger people, future generations, they won't understand this unless they were there. They don't understand the history. I grew up seeing Donald Trump at WrestleMania 4 and WrestleMania 5 when they had it at Trump Plaza. And, we all knew Trump as this, this business guy, and, he was extravagant. Oh, here's a cameo of him in Home Alone 2. And, oh, then he actually does, a time in the WWE, him and Vincent Mann have a shave your head match. And then he gets his reality TV show. Point is, for those of us who grew up with Trump, knowing him in this way, it was completely fictional that this guy would ever be president. It was not possible. It was straight up impossible this guy would ever be president of the United States of America. And this is where I don't know if future generations will get the hyperstitional weight of what happened. Where this dude is not going to be president. It's not going to happen. Well, it happened.
And yet it did.
It did.
The thing is, this often happens in this kind of period, especially in American history. After Lincoln's assassination, everyone turned him into a plaster saint. If you go back and read newspaper stories especially from when he first entered national politics, from the 1860 election and so on, oh boy, he was actually on the receiving end of exactly the same kind of sneering put downs that Trump has received. I'm not equating the two people. I'm pointing that the reaction of the establishment elites to them was the same. And afterwards, of course, he became this titanic figure. We have the Lincoln Memorial. I shudder to think of the Trump Memorial, but it is not impossible at this point. Simply because
he'll build it himself, or at least
no doubt. Well, he's working on a triumphal arch, which I thought was it's frankly rather amusing that people would object to that, because there are actually quite a few of them in American cities. I would every one of the boroughs, as far as I know, every one of the boroughs of New York has one. I certainly have seen the ones in Manhattan and Brooklyn. But yeah, it's just, that, for example, if he dies in office, which is always a possibility. I mean, he's quite an old man and he has an extremely stressful job. Or if one of the assassins finally gets through, they're going to build this utter caricature of a statue of him. He was a heroic figure. They should get an image of him from WrestleMania,
right?
Much, or The Apprentice or something. They should, give the guy the credit of his bizarre political trajectory.
No, I really want the statue where he's like standing over Vince McMahon after having his head shaved.
That would be a good one.
Yeah.
That would be a good one.
So, but no, I think this is why I gravitate to this chapter, because I personally feel this hyperstitional weight where, this cybernetic amplifying process of reinforcing something that's fictional on the one hand, but also considered impossible. This cyber positive feedback loop of its amplification, building it into a reality, it truly is this example of hyperstitions occur, and they are miraculous oftentimes. Now, I don't mean I just grow wings and fly around miracle, but
there's certainly, what the heck just happened?
Right.
Exactly. And that's when magic really works, that's what you get. There are never violations of laws of nature. There are never actual miracles. It's just the most preposterous things that are technically possible but absurd turn out to happen. Yeah. Most people who practice are used to those things, and they get used to the fact that sometimes it works. Sometimes it works remarkably well.
So here's the thing I want to, for clarification's sake, because some people from our audience who aren't really familiar with this, they might have heard this conversation up to now, and they go, "Oh, well, the way John is talking, like magic has nothing to do with spirituality. It's a concrete material process," and we've emphasized that. But even when we talk to Nick Land about CCRU and the pneumogram and all this, there is this other aspect where I think it's like, all right, everybody slow down, because I want to do justice to your perspective, Nick's perspective. And so with the election of Trump, right, there is a way you can just view it in concrete, non-spiritual terms, where a whole group gets fired up and it keeps amplifying, and that momentum forces a change that's a very unlikely change, and something new comes into reality that you don't expect. But and Nick is so big on this, over on X. You emphasize in this chapter gets, and I think this is helpful because you talked about the coincidences. I think we should talk about the gets. And the thing is, this is the point where it's like, it's not just completely non-spiritual. Seems like there's something else. Nick Land calls them lemurs. He calls them lofty powers. And the question is to you, John, what aspect do spiritual forces play in this whole thing?
It really depends. Now, in terms of magic generally, there are magical practices that don't use them. There are magical practices that can use them. There are magical practices that rely on them. And when we talk about spiritual powers, they range across the spectrum. Some of them are very positive and beneficial for humans to interact with. Some of them are entirely the opposite. Many, many others are somewhere in between. One of the reasons I liked the opportunity to do my set of tentacle novels is that I was able to go back to a kind of pagan vision of what deities are and just equip them with tentacles. And it made it possible to talk about the complexities of human relationship with the transcendent, with the divine. We can use that term if you like, without falling immediately into the sort of narrowly Christian viewpoint that's so common these days, that there's one good power and all the others are evil and out to get you. which is again kind of the H.P. Lovecraft was into that, except he didn't have any good powers. They were all, he was an atheist, So all the gods were tentacled horrors about to devour you. But these things are real. One useful way to talk about them is one that I borrowed in this book from Carl Jung, who talks about archetypes. Okay. There are patterns, call them that if you want to, in the deep places of consciousness. They are not unique to any one individual. They function at the place where each of our minds blur out into a substrate, which Jung called the collective unconscious. There are other ways to talk about this, but that's a convenient one, and it's one that most people nowadays will at least listen to without just freaking out completely. And the important thing to keep in mind about the archetypes is they're not passive. They don't just sit there. They don't do whatever you want to. We're not in the world of new thought here, where the universe is just falling over itself to give you whatever you want. They have their own intentions. And a lot of what happens in certain aspects of human life is that you can struggle against those intentions and typically be destroyed. Or you can surf the intentions and things start happening. Carl Jung wrote a fascinating essay about this. He was in Germany, or in Europe, just south of Germany in Switzerland, in the run-up to the Second World War. And in, I think it was 1935, he wrote his essay Wotan. And this was a time when Hitler was considered a 2-bit Mussolini wannabe, who was sure to be thrown out of power any day now as soon as the Germans came to their senses. Nobody had any idea, or next to nobody had any idea, what had actually broken loose in Germany at that time. Jung had it down cold. He explained very clearly, this is an uprising of atavistic material from a very primal level. And it is, as he wrote, a hurricane has broken loose in Germany, where we in Switzerland are convinced that it's still fine weather. And he traced that to the emergence of an archetype that is specifically central to Central and Northern European consciousness, the archetype of Wotan. He didn't say so in this essay, but from that fact, you could simply look at that and say, okay, this is going to be this grand, stampede leading to total destruction, because that's how the myths of Wotan always end. They always go straight to Ragnarok. Okay. And as did Hitler's career, of course. And so a lot of the deep changes in human society, a lot of the possibilities of the individual human have to do with interacting with these archetypal forces and learning to work with them and not to work against them, to figure out if you're dealing with collective issues, as we're discussing now, to figure out what archetype is moving, where is it headed, how can we move in some kind of balance with it so that we might have some chance of achieving what we want and aren't simply flattened by it. When Great Cthulhu rises, you don't want to be too close to the beach. And so that was a focus of a big chunk of the center of my book, talking about archetypes, talking about the various archetypes that we find in different parts of the world, different regions. It's not a racial thing, okay? It's not an ethnic thing. It's not a cultural thing. It seems to depend on geography in a weird sense. People, you see this if you know the long-term history of a place. You can often see entirely different groups of people moving into that place, and all of a sudden they start acting like the ones who were there beforehand. We're fairly early on that process here in North America, because the current inhabitants have only been here for a couple of centuries. But Europeans can already tell at a glance, though, even though our ancestors came from here, we're not like them. We are becoming attuned to the archetypal forces of the American land, which is a very different energy, a very different kind of archetype than what they have in crowded little Europe. And so, so that was a lot of what I was trying to do in that book, is talk about the difference and talk about can we guess where this is headed based on the archetypes that seem to be flowing through the Trump phenomenon.
And it's interesting. So in the book, and I'd like to know what you think about, what happened with the most recent presidential election.
Mhm.
You say, and okay, I still want to touch on the gets thing, like the
Mhm.
7,777,000, like
That's
that thing. Let's talk about that real quick.
okay. Let's talk about gets. Just the basic thing is that on the chans, it became kind of a thing to notice when they had double numbers. Because each post is randomly is assigned a sequential number, and you don't know what the number will be until it goes up, because it just depends on who else is posting how fast. And so when you have when it's 63425 through 77, that's a dub. That's a get. Okay, but it's a dub. It's a double number. Or if it's 865013444, that's a trip, and so on and so forth. And so what happened was that people started noticing that anytime they posted something about Donald Trump, the posts got an unusually large number of gets. And not just dubs. They started seeing long strings. And then I think it was in June of 2016, somebody posted just apropos of nothing in the middle of a thread, Trump will win. And that was the one that came out 77777777. And everyone just kind of looked at each other. There's a thing that I've experienced many times as a teacher of this stuff. When your student finally figures out that it's not just play acting, when your student figures out that we have an acronym, TSW, the polite version is this stuff works.
All we can say, this shit works.
Yeah, I can say, but yeah, we have but I like to introduce the polite version so that people can use it. So yeah, there we are. This shit works. And the TSW moment, the moment when you realize you're not just waving your hands at random, but there is an actual energy at work, that you can do things and that things can be done to you. People freak out. Inevitably. I get the panicked email or the panicked phone call or what have you of somebody going, oh my God, it works. I think most of poll had their TSW moment when it was either when they got all those sevens or when Hillary did her cited beef routine.
Well, right. So with the sevens, right? Like, so there's stuff in the background here that the audience probably doesn't get. So on the one hand, you guys know that 777 slot machines, it's a jackpot, but this also is the number of Aleister Crowley's famous, what would you call it? It's an encyclopedia of references.
It's a dictionary of symbolism.
Right.
Yeah, and he didn't write it. He stole most of it from McGregor Mathers, as usual.
Okay.
He was a serious plagiarist, among other things.
But the point, 777 in the occult tradition, it carries meaning. It's significant, and somebody outside of it might not get that significance.
Okay, yeah.
So could you talk about that just for a minute?
Yeah, it's simply put. My take is that it was simply a way. On the one hand, there's the jackpot symbolism. On the other hand, yes, there's magic going on here. Also, I think it was perhaps a not very veiled hint. Look up the symbolism of what's happening, suckers. And with the whole business about Kek, the Egyptian frog god, and the amusing thing to me is that right about just before I'd encountered my first reference to Kek, the Egyptian frog god, I had just decided to put into the second of my tentacle novels Tsathoggua, the toad god from Clark Ashton Smith. I just decided, okay, Tsathoggua is going to be the major great old one active in the novel I'm writing right now. And then I think it was that day I checked what was going on, and all of a sudden everyone's talking about Kek the frog god. I'm going, okay.
Yeah. So here's the thing, though. So you see all these indicators that something's happening in 2016, right? But you didn't see this in 2020. Did you see this in 2024?
No. Basically, it felt to me as though, and my divination suggests, 2016 was necessary to break through a certain barrier, if you will, to make it possible for the completely absurd prospect of Donald Trump's election as president of the United States to happen. Once that happened, things started flowing in their own route. And there were still some remarkable, there were remarkable synchronicities, but most of them were personal. For example, the day after the 2020 election, when all of a sudden vote totals swung Biden's way instantly overnight, I went for a walk. I had an errand to run. I walked across the Seekonk River, and as I was walking, a bald eagle comes right across. It might have been 50 feet from my head. I never saw a bald eagle there before or afterwards, and I took it as an omen. It's going to be okay. Things are going to work out one way or the other, as indeed they did. And so, we're not finished with the story yet, was what that was telling me, and we're not finished with it at this point. But I don't. There's the other thing is the other crucial thing. One of the things that I spent a long time trying to teach people in, of all persuasions in dealing with practical magic is that there are of course the 4 classic magical virtues: to know, to dare, to will, and to be silent. Okay. One of my teachers used to say instead, to know, to dare, to will, and to shut the fuck up. Okay. And he's right. OPSEC, operational security, is essential in magic as it is in military operations. If you go around babbling to everyone what you're trying to do, you will fail. It's one of the reasons why the magic resistance went nowhere, because they were so deeply enamored into posturing, pretending to be the Rebel Alliance and posturing in this little Star Wars movie that was running in their own heads. I think a lot of people have caught on to that, and on both sides. I've noticed that magic resistance seems to have piped down considerably. They may have finally realized that, the rules of magic apply to them too. And so there may be lots of stuff going on, but nobody's stupid enough to talk about it. The only outfits I know that are doing, the only groups of people I know who are doing serious magic in this situation are simply following Dion Fortune's advice and doing positive magic to heal and strengthen the United States.
Nance, what are you thinking?
I mean, I actually, talking about magic and spells and PR. I mean, since we talked a bit about Jung, I think it's appropriate to talk about how PR came from Edward Bernays, who was Freud's nephew. I also think talking about, like, if we're talking about PR and management as the secular side of this, of politics and magic, I think, I don't know, there's Adolphe Quetelet came up with the term l'homme moyen, the average man, and from that, social sciences kind of blossomed and became what they are today, largely, by way of people like Edward Bernays, but also people like Boltzmann and James Clerk Maxwell taking these social theories and then applying them to mathematics, and then people took those mathematics and applied them back onto kind of society and populations as a whole.
Always fixating on the lowest common denominator, always fixating on la moyenne, on the middle guy, the average. And if you want to manipulate people en masse, that's what you have to do. The thing I would point out about Bernays is that he was very good at publicity, including for himself. He was much less effective than he claimed. For example, he was hired as a consultant for the 1932 presidential campaign of Herbert Hoover. Hoover was stomped in that campaign by Franklin Roosevelt. So Bernays had this shtick about how the masses were putty in the hands of a good marketer, but that was simply his sales pitch. One of the things, again, as we saw with John Cornyn in the recent primaries, he outspent Ken Paxton by something close to 10-1, and he still got absolutely shellacked because I mean, or for that matter, think of all of the marvelous sales campaigns for consumer products or for Hollywood movies, heaven help us, that have crashed and burned totally because people actually have their own opinions. And especially if you don't pay attention, if your notion of la moyenne is different from what people actually want, what they need, what their concerns are, you fail. It'd be like trying to summon a spirit where using the wrong sigil and the wrong name. It's like trying to call somebody on the phone when you don't have their number and are just punching keys at random. So it's one of the things we're seeing, in fact, right now in the sort of downside, the decline of the bureaucratic administrative state, is precisely the failure of an entire world of attempted methods for social management that were predicated on a view of the individual and of the mass that are actually wildly inaccurate and that leave too much out to be functional. We'll see what happens.
That leads me kind of where I want to go, like the course of the conversation. I feel myself being pulled into, is it a cycle that we're stuck in, and are we repeating a downfall? Like, are we on the down going? Like,
Yeah, and here partly, in large part, there are straightforward physical reasons for that. You can determine the wealth of an economy, as ecological economists have been pointing out for a very long time, by the simple measurement of available energy per capita. Okay, and that's been contracting steadily for quite some time now. I mean, we're still producing a lot of oil, but look how much more energy it takes to get that oil. Light sweet crude from a shallow well, the kind of thing that made America's economy boom in the 20th century, it takes like 1/3 of 1% of the energy value of each barrel of oil to extract it, refine it, and get it to where it's going.
Jeez.
Okay, exactly. It's insanely rich. Fracking condensate from deep wells that, again, have to be fracked, and there's all these other things. It's, you're starting to get to the point that you're shedding 10, 15, 20 more percent. And as that figure goes up, the availability of real wealth in society goes down. Then you add in the effect of increased population, which of course that would be balancing out if not for mass immigration. But you factor in that, you factor in all the other ways in which we've gotten stuck on excessive energy use. And then you start understanding why it's very rare to walk down a sidewalk that's not cracked in America today, why our infrastructure is going to bits, why pervasive crapification is all through our economy, and all the various forms of stealth inflation and so on. It's simply a function of the fact that we have plenty of money, but we don't have enough wealth, enough real wealth. And so we are in decline. We have been in decline since the 1970s. And there's that broad energetic decline. There's also a cycle that, that Oswald Spengler, the Beach Poet's favorite historical philosopher, where basically a civilization rises to a certain point, it works through its range of possibilities, and then it kind of runs out. And no, we're not actually part of that. We are, because the civilization we're talking about is European. Spengler called it Faustian civilization, and it has its own things. But when a civilization is at its peak, it expands, it brings new areas kind of somewhat into its orbit. North America is part of that. We are part of the pseudomorphosis, to use Spengler's term, of Faustian society. And so we have this thin overlay of European-style civilization over something very different. But we're seeing the breakdown of that. We're seeing more and more people resisting the European mode of civilization. We're seeing a greater schism between the coastal elites, which are very, very Europeanized. They all their ideas, the number of people you will meet in an East Coast city who desperately wish they were Scandinavians. They imagine themselves as being Europeans. All of their ideas are copied from Europe. Well, Europeans do X. Why can't we? Well, it's a different society, and of course, they're also not paying for their own defense bills, and so they have a lot more money than we do. But there's a lot of stuff going on like that. But that's breaking down. That European veneer is cracking, and that's normal. That's also normal in the process of the cycles of civilization And so we're going to see that dissolve more and more, and the United States settle back into, I mean, we're a barbarian society. I mean, you probably know in late Roman times, you had the barbarian kingdoms that were very powerful and often more powerful than the emperor in Rome. And the barbarian king would put on a toga, and he would mint some crappy imitation Roman coins, and he would call his warlords together and call them a senate every so often. And they'd kind of go through the motions, because that's what you do in late Roman times if you're a serious, kingdom. But it was an incredibly thin veneer over barbarism. America is a barbarian society. We are not a civilized society. We have not evolved our own civilization yet. We're grunting, farting barbarians. Every European already knows this, by the way. Some of them were polite enough not to say it to our faces. Now, this thing is the same thing is true of Russians. Russians are closer to civilization than several people have suggested, several theorists have suggested that probably sometime in the next century, you're going to see the beginning of an actual native Russian civilization emerging. And that'll be, we're kind of going through the first birth pains now. But everyone in Europe knows Russians are not Europeans. They just aren't. They can act like it. They can put on a veneer, but it's like, watching somebody from Texas trying to fit in Paris. It does not convince.
John, one of the first times, because, this in my early 20s, this was still kind of news to me. I didn't really understand this dynamic. And this was around the time that I started learning about foreign films. And I met some interesting artists at the local bookstore. And of course, they start giving me Bergman and Fellini. And so I'm watching Fellini's, I believe it's La Dolce Vita. And, Marcello, this kind of classy, civilized Italian guy, right? And they present the American guy who he gets in a fight with as like this big, brutish kind of idiot. And it was very apparent to me. I'm like, yeah, that's how they view us right there.
And they're right. Okay.
Yeah, we're not wrong.
No, exactly. We're Conan the Barbarian, so wandering our way down into Aquilonia. And, who is this? He's big, he's strong, he can mash you flat to the dust with a blow of his sword, but he doesn't actually know that much. So yeah.
But it's also, can we say, it's diet caffeine free barbarism, where like there's a reason we invented pro wrestling.
Well, the thing is, that's the veneer. The further you go away from the coastal bubble, the further you get into something a little more like genuine barbarism.
Like I'm in Kansas City, but you go out and
get away
Missouri.
Get away from the cities, please. I knew guys up in Appalachia who would have fit perfectly well in a chainmail thong with an iron helmet on their head. I've known bikers and various other people like that who qualified, and they're kind of the wave of the American future. And it used to be that there were many more of them in America, and there will be many more of them again.
So is our future Mad Max apocalypse?
No.
No.
There are two paired myths in our society about the future. One of them is Tomorrowland, and the other one is Mad Max. Okay, they're both as fake as a $3 bill. Okay, they're both totally fake, and they're used in concert by people who are saying, if you do what we tell you, you'll get Tomorrowland, and if you don't, you'll get Mad Max. It's the same. It's the good cop, bad cop routine. Okay, no, it's simple. It's decline. Usually, the decline of a civilization takes between 100 and 300 years, and ours is proceeding at the usual pace. It'll bottom out in a dark age where most of our complex technology will be lost, but a lot of the basic technology will remain in place. There will be a period of political chaos, and then new civilizations will rise out of that. It's totally normal. And, people live perfectly fulfilling, happy lives. Well, one of the things a lot of people don't realize, by the way, is that the fall of Rome was actually a great improvement in the lives of most people in the Roman world. You can see that by archaeologists would notice. You've seen that by studying skeletons. All of us, when Roman power collapses in a given region, there's signs of improved nutrition. People are getting more food. People are in better health because they aren't being bled dry to prop up a dying system. And that's a lot of what we're already seeing here in the United States as the bureaucratic managerial system implodes. We're seeing improvement in conditions among ordinary working class Americans. I expect to see a lot more of that. And this is just one of these sort of intermediate cycles in the long, what I call the long road down, the long descent. But this is normal. This is as normal as progress, as normal as anything else in history. And there's no reason to get all bent out of shape about it. This is the weather we have. It so happens that summer is followed by autumn and autumn by winter. It's not that, we're not the Destiny's darlings. We're not going to have summer followed by uber summer, then by uber summer, and it will never snow again. That's the Tomorrowland fantasy. The apocalyptic fantasy, of course, is that an ice age begins tomorrow. Yeah. Both of them are smoking their shorts, and they're both distorted. They're both lying. I mean, when you were a child, fusion was 20 years in the future. Mm-hmm. When I was a child, fusion power was 20 years in the future. When my dad was a teenager, fusion power was 20 years in the future. 10 million years from now, when human beings have been replaced by the distant descendant of chipmunks, fusion power will still be 20 years in the future. There are very good reasons to think that, to believe that, and which most people are, especially most people in the physics industry, are refusing to talk about. But it's very clear. This, yeah, sure, you can believe in this you want to, but you're smoking. You're smoking something. Mm-hmm. We're not going to colonize the stars. We're not going to have limitless fusion power. We're not going to have any of these stupid fantasies. And no matter how many times they try it, yes, you can build a flying car, but it'll be a lousy car and a lousy airplane, and it will cost way too much. Deal.
Okay, so I want to bring
now
it
that
back.
I've laid it down around everybody.
No, I want to bring it back because there's been some years since the book was released and you wrote it. So I look around and my friends who have been Trump supporters, never have I seen the Trump base more upset with him than now. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious about what you think about some of these decisions he's made recently. I mean, the Iran thing really pissed off people on the right. This thing where, he was recently interviewed or a journalist asked him a question. Hey, do you take into account how all this affects Americans' finances? He goes, no, I don't think about it at all when I'm thinking and the fact that he still hasn't released the fully redacted Epstein files. There's a lot of things that have pissed off people on the right.
I know.
What do you think about what's going on?
Okay, first of all, the situation with Iran is pretty straightforward. He and his advisors believed the Israelis and the Iranian expat community that the Iranian people would rise up against the mullahocracy as soon as the leadership was vaporized. So they vaporized leadership. It didn't happen. The Israelis were smoking something. The Iranian expats were wildly optimistic, and it didn't happen. So at that point, it became a matter of finding an off-ramp that wouldn't leave America humiliated. And the Iranians are looking for an off-ramp too, and everyone's dickering over the fine details right now. If he had pulled it off, if they had been right, it would have been an overwhelming triumph. But the thing to keep in mind, there's a backstory here, which is that the fracking boom is running on fumes. Most of the areas that were heavily fracked have already been abandoned because they got everything out they can get out. And so there has to be new sources of petroleum getting into the American economy, or we are in deep kimchi. So thus the whole business with Venezuela, which again, that was the fact that went so smoothly, doubtless led to the overconfidence that we now see in the business with Iran. And but the whole point of the business with Iran was to come up with a with a satisfying excuse to remove the sanctions and get Iranian oil back onto the open market, because they're one of the few major sources of oil that's left out there. I also expect to see the Ukrainian war. The U.S. of course is backpedaling hard from that, and I expect to see sanctions on Russian oil dropped as well, just again to keep the fuel flowing into people's tanks. That's a dominant factor right now. But the thing to keep in mind, if you look back a ways, there have been many situations where Trump has done things that irritated his followers, and because there's a difference between the Trump that they imagine and the actual reality TV star who's in the White House. And it's not as though they're going to vote for the Democrats. So he's got a lot of wiggle room here. They can be very, very annoyed with him, but they're not going to vote for the Democrats. And since, one way or another, his presidency only has a few years to run, and it may have less than that if he dies in office. I think everyone's going to, well, of course, if he does die in office, he will be turned into a plaster saint, as previously noted, and everyone will quietly forget about all of these things. Again, that happened with Lincoln, and with others, FDR. George Washington was the original beneficiary of that process, much less the heroic figure that he's been made out to be. But yeah, so yeah, people are going to be vexed. My guess is you're going to see him backpedal, because he generally has pretty good instincts in terms of paying attention to what actually concerns people. And I suspect on the one hand, there will be some backpedaling. On the other hand, of course, the Iran thing didn't work. And so it's a matter of, how do we spin this so we can extract ourselves from the situation? The fact that other than a few missiles being lobbed from place to place, now and again, the fighting has mostly stopped. It's just a matter of coming up with a convenient excuse.
So maybe the best place to end is just maybe getting a kind of updated reflection on the last chapter, The Tatters of the King, Magic and Power in the Post-Trump America. Where do you think magic and power are going in now in the post-Trump America?
Okay, what we have now as post-Trump America begins to take shape, what we have, first of all, the crucial thing that nobody wants to deal with is that we have inflated our economy on money pumped in from the rest of the world. And as the dollar loses its status as reserve currency, as the United States loses its position as global hegemon, that's going away. That's simply going away. We will not be able to run huge deficits anymore. That's what's behind the big push to eliminate fraud. Everyone knew that there was a fantastic amount of fraud. It's quite possible that if they eliminate all the fraud in federal expenditures right now, we'll have a balanced budget. And that will be very convenient when we default on our debt, as we will. It will be probably a couple of technical defaults at first, but the thing is, nations do this all the time. Russia did it in 1998. It caused major financial crises elsewhere, but it was the beginning of Russia's recovery from its post-Soviet depression. And so in the same way, the U.S. will default on its debts. It will engage in frantic rearrangements, and then have a lot of its domestic problems will probably begin to decrease. But we have to wean our government off the constant inflow of foreign money first. And that's going to mean a fantastic number of managerial jobs are going away forever. The whole hoopla around AI is an excuse for that. I think we all know the LLMs they're not actually intelligent. They can't actually do that much, but neither is middle management. It's true. It's been demonstrated. Your basic middle manager can be easily replaced by a computer program. And there are also vast numbers of people who simply aren't doing anything useful. I forget the guy's name, but he was the founder of Bolt, the company. And he was brought back in because they ended up in financial trouble. It's one of these staffing companies. And one of the first things he did was fire the entire HR department. Because he said, he looked at what HR was doing. He's saying, they're creating problems that don't exist. So he fired them, and all those problems went away. And of course, so did a big chunk of paycheck. He replaced them with a much smaller department with a much smaller list of duties, and without the basic HR rule of finding things to be offended about and then punishing people for it.
So we're talking about what David Graeber called bullshit jobs.
Yes, there's that's probably half the cubicle workforce in the United States, and most of them are going to be unemployed within the next decade or so. Basically what's happening is that the managerial class is going through the same kind of purge that the working class went through in the 70s and 80s. Mm-hmm. And politically explosive, you bet. That's the thing is, I think people are well aware of this, and that's where a lot of the screaming about Trump and the Trumpistas comes from. They know, their jobs are on the line, their identities are on the line, and there's going to be enormous changes. But we simply can't afford to keep paying all these people to do work that doesn't need to be done. The collapse of the whole DEI business. People yelled about it this week. It was all simply an employment program for people with degrees in critical theory, who are basically unemployable in any other context. So you have DEI departments set up so you can make people hire them and they have jobs, okay? That didn't work, and now a lot of them are out of work. And now we're going to have more and more people who are out of work. And, all of these smart teenagers I know are headed for apprenticeships. They're not going to university. They know perfectly well it doesn't lead anywhere. Yeah. And so post-Trump America is going to be an America that's completely retooling for a different kind of economy, not an imperial tribute economy like we have, but probably something much closer to the kind of economy that America had in the early 20th century, when it was mostly manufacturing and production of goods and services. And, actually, I should say non-financial goods and services to people rather than to corporations. And so all that added together with the accelerating decline of the collapse of population fertility, which is again normal in a situation like this. Aging civilizations always have that kind of thing. It's going to be a very different world, but not overnight. Just a gradual process of disruptive change leading to other things.
Okay.
Okay.
Nance, anything you want to ask or touch on before we wrap this up?
The one thing I want to hear from you is, we talked about hyperstition and hypostition. What is retrostition?
Okay.
I want to know.
So
I do a lot of retro, so I want to hear about your retrostition.
Retrostition is, and it's actually, I think talking about spells and language is appropriate to retrostition, because retrostition is an attempt to talk about a state of being fixated on a past that doesn't exist, but it doesn't matter that it doesn't exist because it's in the past, and so it's something that's gone. And also, when language itself stops to operate, the way language works is that it's broken, and we fill it in. Like, it's you and I having a conversation is what actually makes the communication function. It's not the language, it's not the code, it's the users of the code
who are manipulating the code to try to get meaning across. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and it fails. It necessarily fails, but that's why it works. So being in a state of retrostition is looking at the past, hence retro, and language, rather than being this broken thing that requires mutual operation, it becomes this positivistic thing. So I like to think of it as if you're Mickey Mouse casting a magic spell in Fantasia, where it's a spell and it does what you want it to do. And so it's this state of something resembling paranoia, something resembling psychosis. But it's a failure to live in the living world itself. And so you're retreating into a fictionalized something that doesn't exist, and it's predicated on fantasy, Mickey Mouse, Fantasia. Yeah.
Now, the thing that comes to my mind is that's just as common, especially nowadays, people trying to live in an imagined future.
often takes the shape of an imagined future.
Yeah. Actually, these days, that's there's
Would that be a prostition?
Yeah, well, no, there's something very complex going on here, because the future that so many people are fixated on is a future that passed its pull date half a century ago.
Yeah. And it's 1950. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the imagined future of the past.
Yeah. Tomorrowland. It's Walt Disney.
Yeah, exactly. It's Walt Disney's 1950s Tomorrowland. So it is we're getting into weird time warps here. Probably some lemurs will pop up shortly.
Well, and it does come out of that type of thought. It comes out of conversations Mikey and I have been having. Jeez Louise. But if a hyperstition
English verb tenses, yes.
If a hyperstition is a fiction that makes itself real, and a hypostition is a fiction that precludes itself from becoming real, then a retrostition is a fiction that says never mind reality itself. I will stay in fantasy land forever.
Okay.
Nance, how do I put a retrostition is a fiction that enables a fictional past to foreclose the actual past.
Yeah.
And it would then also necessarily foreclose the present, the real present,
exactly.
And the actual future. Yeah.
So I go on to say in this thing, because I'm trying to work this out too in my own head, riffing off of Nance. Retrostition is not, therefore, the mere denial of the reality of a specific past, but rather, when carefully thought through, involves the stubborn rejection of the reality of the actual past altogether. Retrostition involves the vortex of reality barring fictionality. Retrostition is a fiction that unmakes the actual past in the image and likeness of a fictional past. And given how past, present, and future are all intertwined, retrostition is the becoming fiction of the whole of real time. Thus, retrostition is temporal psychosis.
Yeah. Okay. Now, is that from your own writing, or?
Right, that's me riffing off Nance. Yeah.
I like it. Okay, yeah.
Because, like I said, when he developed, I call this his 3 threes, because
the trio of triads, or the triad of trios.
Because so it goes like this. Hyperstition is connected to neurosis, and it's future oriented. Hypostition is connected to perversion, and it is present oriented. And retrostition is connected to psychosis, and it is past oriented. So that's he's connected these 3, drawing on Heidegger and Lacan and CCRU. Okay. And I was like, well, Nance, this is your 3 threes.
Now, Nance, have you published something on this that I can cite?
Yeah, I'll shoot you the link after this.
That'd be really useful, because that strikes me as a very useful framework for discussing some aspects of the way our society desperately tries to avoid dealing with its future.
I totally agree.
Yeah, I think it is, and it's Heidegger, Lacan. There's also Baudrillard, but it's withdrawing from the actual world that exists. And what is the actual world that exists but the future that's rushing at us kind of head on, and we're scared of that, and we're retreating from it. So we watch Game of Thrones and Harry Potter and all these things. And yeah, some of us do. Yeah. I don't know about throwing away my television, but I do.
From my cold dead
hand. I think you're right. I think John Carpenter with They Live is explaining magic, and Cronenberg with Videodrome is also trying to tell us something.
One of these days, when we have a little more time, we can bring Zardoz into the picture.
Oh my gosh.
I did a blog post on Zardoz at one point. It was very useful as an introduction to situationism, actually. But
that's awesome.
I have the novel as well as the video. I actually read the novel. I mean, the novel was available through Scholastic Book Services. You remember the outfit that did the children? I got an SBS copy of the novel. At the age of 12, a kid could not get into a movie that showed a lot of breasts. Okay, but I could get the novel. So yeah, that helped warp my mind at a very early age. Still have
Sean Connery's masterpiece.
Most of the straight women I know love that movie largely because there he is in a bright orange jockstrap, a pair of thigh-high boots, a pair of cross bandoliers, and not a stitch else.
Doesn't he have? He has the ponytail and the mustache, right?
He has the ponytail. That's part of that's part of the appeal. But yes, we can certainly bring the ultimate talking head into the picture in a future conversation. Now, I do at some point hope that we have another chance to have a conversation with Nick.
Yeah, so do we. Totally.
Good.
And I know he would love to do that too.
Let's see if we can schedule something. And generally, as always, I have very much enjoyed our conversation.
Well, John, thank you so much for this. This has been great. And I think the image of Sean Connery in Zardos is the perfect image to end on. So thank you again for that. Have a good one. We appreciate you.
Thanks, John.
Take care.